in some styles of parenting, some parents will opt to allow their child to skin their legs and get out there and make mistakes. And some parents will go, no, 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 we got to bubble wrap them and keep them safe and keep them germ free. And so the progressives in, I guess, the bigger picture, they kind of have a different angle on this. And if I could say so, a lot of times these types of things, who was it that said, never let a crisis go to waste? It wasn't that Rahm Emanuel? I think so, the mayor of Chicago now. All of these things are a means to an end. In other words, they're waiting in the wings for the next shoe to drop so that they can come right out in front of the cameras on a microphone and say, oh, we've got to do this. You have to surrender more of your liberties because it's for your own good. So why is it that we constantly ignore this mountain range, not just a mountain of data? This is a mountain range of empirical data that we know that you cannot trust the progressives. They have no they have no reverence towards the law. They have no reverence towards life or individual liberty. They don't care whatever it takes to get their objective in subjugating and controlling you, because you're dangerous and you need to be controlled for your own good. I mean, that is their attitude. You can't tell me otherwise. So the statist, nationalist, communist, or the other word for them that I like to use is Platonist, because let's give credit due to the real genius of thought of the statist ideology, or at least the guy that first wrote it on paper, which was Plato. And so these are Platonists that follow that path of the republic, of creating a state that controls every facet of our lives. Well, these folks, these statists, nationalists, communists, Platonists, they have no concern of the cost of their decisions. They don't care as long as it gets them to their end. Hitler didn't care. He had no compunction and no remorse whatsoever of how many people died in his chambers. And don't forget, it wasn't the Jews that first died in his chambers. The first people that they put to death were those who were the sick, infirmate, or those who were lame and elderly, and those, let's just call them the non-productive members of society, because that was the angle. These people are just a drain on our resources. And come on, grandma, come on, poor kids that, don't have the full faculties and so forth. They were put to death. And I think it was something like 250,000, 500,000, somewhere in there. It was a lot of people that they removed from their society so that they could live a little bit better. And you've got to be kidding me, right? But no, that's the mind model of a statist. And Hitler was a statist. He wanted to nationalize and control everything. If you read Mein Kampf, which I happen to cite in my first book, one of the things he had to focus on was he had to take and get rid of the republic. He had to pull all powers from the subordinate states within the Republic of Germany so that he could nationalize and control all things. That was his objective, so that he could move forward with his big agenda. And I'm telling you, he had a big agenda. And so do the statists. And actually, if you look at the empirical mountain range of data, they constantly do the exact same thing. Napoleon didn't care. Stalin didn't care. Pol Pot, he didn't care. As a matter of fact, Pol Pot, took a completely different approach. I mean, what did he do? He actually executed anybody with an education. He saw some of the mistakes, he thought, in the last revolutions and goes, you know what? They kept some of those smart people around. I'm getting rid of them. So if you look at their goals, their objectives, and how they get there, this is just a huge trend. And if you travel along this mountain range of empirical data, you will find that this is a very disturbing trend. And so I apologize for cutting this thought out, but I will be right back after a word from. I was just talking about how the progressives have no value for human life. They're not compassionate people. They really don't care. What they care about are their ultimate goals, and that ultimate goal is subjugation and control. It's all about power and control. And so, because these folks don't value life, that's because these folks don't value individual liberty and individual sovereignty. Our nation was founded on these principles, folks, and so that's why it's incompatible to have statist ideologies, statist programs, and statist government, because the cost of that is individual liberty and individual sovereignty. Now, I'll get into this a little. Let's talk a little bit about Plato's Republic. Plato's Republic basically establishes this concept that the state is the sovereign. Okay, so we understand what a state is, right? What's a state? Well, the state could be the state you live in, because in our republic, each state are independent sovereigns. And as a matter of fact, each of the original colonies were listed in the treaty with Britain and King George as independent sovereigns. They did not recognize the conglomerate or the confederacy of these independent states. But when they moved forward in creating the Constitution, and even though there's other nations, whether they recognize this republic or not, we are a republic of states, and that means nations. A head of state is the leader of a nation. So the governors are heads of state. And if you really think about it, our governors in the United States are equal to those, let's call them heads of states of Italy, France, England, and so forth. The only difference probably between some of those states and our states is some of those states still have monarchs. Anyway, moving on. So who is the state within Plato's Republic as we look at today's Platonist play or their plan and strategy? Who's the state? Is the state the United States, or is the state every single state? No, I don't think so. And I think what we need to start looking at is that the states are like administrative functions, because it's not like America's driving this. Why is all of these things happening around the world as far as destabilization for the Arab Spring, this plan of migration of these problems moving into Europe, out of the Mediterranean and out of Africa, all the unstable government in Africa, the problems and the oppression that's going on in Asia, like Indonesia and the Philippines and so forth. And so who is it that is the state? And I'm going to tell you, this is a new world concept that Adam Weishaupt talked about. And this state is a collective of elitists who have brought into a plan to subjugate the world. And they basically bought into Weishaupt's plan of what he basically proposed for a plan of the Illuminati in obtaining control. And so, not that the Illuminati is necessarily behind this anymore, because that's why when you really start looking at a single conspiracy theory, it doesn't hold water. But when you start interconnecting things and saying, well, maybe these things are connected, and maybe these things are a part of a different conspiracy, but maybe it's not Russia, maybe it's not China, maybe it's not the United States, and I'm telling you, it's not. It is a small collective of elitists who are driving this plan, and these people have money, lots of money. And if you look at the world's richest people and those people, so there's different types of riches, by the way, and so the crowns are pretty rich. And it's hard to quantify what a crown is worth, but we know Bill Gates is worth billions, and so is Warren Buffett, and so forth and so on. And there's lots of billionaires that do not live in the United States that don't necessarily care for us and our freedoms and so forth. So as progressives point their finger of judgment at corporations, most of these are really not the problem. There are a few select globalist corporations that are a part of the problem, because they are a part of moving everybody forward. Most nations and globalists are simply, and I see globalist corporations are simply tools for the global elitists. These fools or tools, whatever you want to call them, are not the end in themselves. They are the means to an end. This process is moving the world into subjugation as a plan. And so as we slowly look at us sliding towards spending us into oblivion, what happens? Well, do we just, set the debt clock to zero again and say, well, we're just going to ignore that? Or are we going to allow, or will our debtors allow us to do that? You got to see there's a contract involved in this debting and loaning of money, and people hold money contracts pretty precious. But there's one contract that most people used to hold even more precious, and that contract was the contract of liberty. People were willing to die for liberty. Just like in those times, they also were willing to die for their honor. You got to remember, how did Alexander Hamilton die? He was killed in a duel over honor. And so I just want you to understand that back in those days, when liberty meant everything, then people were willing to die for it. But today, it just seems like riches and control that people are willing to die for. So we have to start changing our paradigm, and we have to start understanding the cost of liberty before we have to really fight to get it back. We can't afford to do that, folks. And we have the opportunity right here in front of us. And I've been providing you all sorts of marketing concepts of these terrible things that we've gotten out of the